The pianoforte. There must be, practically on the part of everyone who attends a pianoforte recital, some degree of curiosity regarding the instrument itself. Therefore, it seems to me pertinent to institute at the very outset an inquiry into what the pianoforte is, and how it became what it is, the most practical, most expressive, and most universal of musical instruments, the instrument of the concert hall and of the intimate home circle. Knowledge of such things surely will enhance the enjoyment of a pianoforte recital, should be in fact a prerequisite to it. The pianoforte is the most used, and for that very reason, perhaps, the most abused of musical instruments. Even its real name generally is denied it. Most people call it a piano, although piano is a musical term denoting a degree of sound, soft, gentle, low, the opposite of forte, which means strong and loud. The combination of the two terms in one word, pianoforte, signifies that the instrument is capable of being played both softly and loudly, both piano and forte. It was this capacity that distinguished it from its immediate precursors, the old-time harpsichords and clavichords. One of the first requirements in learning how to understand music is to learn to call things musical by their right names. To speak of a pianoforte as a piano is one of our unjustifiable modern shortcuts of speech, a characteristic specimen of linguistic laziness, and evidence of utter ignorance concerning the origin and character of the instrument. If I were asked to express in a single phrase the importance of this instrument in the musical life of today, I would say that the pianoforte is the orchestra of the home. Indeed, the title of the familiar song, "What is Home Without a Mother?" might, without any undue stretch of imagination, be changed to "What is home without a pianoforte?" Although if you are working hard at your music and practicing scales and finger exercises several hours a day, it might be wiser not to ask your neighbour's opinion on this point. The king of instruments. In households where there is no pianoforte, we seem to breathe a foreign atmosphere, says Oscar B. in his history of the instrument and its players. And he adds with perfect truth that it has become an essential part of our life, giving its form to our whole musical culture, and stamping its characteristics upon our whole conception of music. Surely, out of every 10 musical persons, layman or professional, at least 9 almost invariably have received their first introduction to music through the pianoforte, and have derived the greater part of their musical knowledge from it. Even composers like Wagner and Meyerbeer, whose work is wholly associated with opera, had their first lessons in music on the pianoforte. And Meyerbeer achieved brilliant triumphs as a concert pianist before he turned his attention to the operatic stage. Of all musical instruments, the pianoforte is the most intimate and at the same time the most public. The favourite of the lonely mourner and of the solitary soul whose joy seeks expression, and the tie that unites the circle of family and friends. Yet it also thrills the great audience of the concert hall and rouses it to the highest pitch of enthusiasm. It is the king of instruments, and the reason for its supremacy is not far to seek. Weitzmann, the author of the first comprehensive account of the pianoforte and its literature, speaks of its ability to lend living expression to all phases of emotion for which language lacks words. Its full resonant tone, its volume vying with that of the orchestra, its command of every shade of sound, from the gentlest pianissimo to the most powerful forte, and its mechanism, which permits of the most rapid runs and passages, and at the same time of sustained singing notes and phrases. Music under one's fingers. But this is not all. There is an overture by Weber entitled The Ruler of the Spirits. Well, he who commands the row of white and black keys is ruler of the spirits of music. He has music, all that music can give, within the grasp of his 2 hands, under his 10 fingers. The pianoforte can render anything in music. Besides music of its own, it can reproduce the orchestra or the voice with even greater fidelity than the finest engraving renders a painting. For only to the eyes of one familiar with the painting does the engraving suggest the colour scheme of the original, whereas, through certain nuances of technique that are more easily felt than described, the pianoforte virtuoso, who is playing an arrangement of an orchestra composition, can make his audience hear certain instruments of the orchestra. Even such characteristic effects as the far-carrying pizzicato, or the rumbling of the double basses, or their low growl, the hollow reverberating percussions of the timpani, sustained notes on the horns, the majestic accents of trombones, the sharp shrill of piccolos, while some of the most effective pianoforte pieces are arrangements of songs. Moreover, there are pianoforte compositions, like the Hungarian Rhapsodies of Liszt, which, while conceived and carried out in the true spirit of the instrument, pianistic, as they say, yet suggest the tone colours of the orchestra without permitting these to obtrude themselves too much. This is one of the many services of Liszt, the giant of virtuosos and a giant among composers, to his art. It has been said that Liszt played the whole orchestra on the pianoforte. He did even more. He developed the technique of the instrument to such a point that the suggestion of many of the clang tints of the orchestra has become part of its heritage. This dual capacity of the pianoforte, the fact that it has a tone quality wholly peculiar to itself, so that when, for example, we are playing Chopin, we never think of the orchestra, while at the same time it can take up into itself and reproduce, or at least suggest, the tone colours of other instruments, is one of its most remarkable characteristics. Quite as remarkable and as interesting and important is the circumstance that these tone tints are wholly dependent upon the player. There is nothing peculiar to the make of the strings, the sounding board, the hammers, that tends to produce these effects. They are due wholly to the player's subtle manipulation of the keys, so that we get the added thrill of the virtuoso's personal magnetism. The pianoforte owes much of its popularity, much of its supremacy, to the fact that a player's interpretation of a composition cannot be marred by anyone but himself. It rests in his hands alone, whereas the conductor of an orchestra is dependent upon 100 players, some of whom may have no more soul than so many wooden Indians. Even supposing a conductor to be gifted with a highly poetic and musically sensitive nature, it is impossible that so many men of varying degrees of temperament as go to make up an orchestra, and none of them probably a virtuoso of the highest rank, will be as sympathetically responsive to his baton as a pianoforte is to the fingers of a musical poet like Paderewski, for the fingers of a great virtuoso are the ambassadors of his soul. Melody and accompaniment on one instrument. This personal one-man control of the instrument has been of inestimable value to the pianoforte in establishing itself in its present unassailable position. Moreover, in controlling it, the pianist commands all the resources of music. With his two thumbs alone, he can accomplish what no player upon any other instrument in common use is capable of doing with all 10 fingers. He can sound together the lowest and the highest notes in music, for all the notes of music as we know it simply await the pressure of the fingers upon the keys of the pianoforte. It is the one instrument capable of power as well as of sweetness and grace, which places the whole range of harmony and counterpoint at the disposal of one player. A vocalist can sing an air, but can you imagine a vocalist singing through an entire programme without accompaniment? After half a dozen unaccompanied songs, the singing even of the greatest prima donna would become monotonous for lack of harmony. The violin and violoncello, next to the pianoforte the most frequently heard instruments in the concert hall, labour under the same disadvantage as the singer. They are dependent upon the accompaniment of others. The pianist, on the other hand, has the inestimable advantage of being able to play melody and accompaniment on one instrument at the same time, all in one. While singing with some of his fingers the tender melodic phrase of a Chopin nocturne, he completes with the others the exquisite weave of harmony, and reveals the musical fabric to us in all its beauty. Moreover, it is the pianist himself who does this, not someone else at his signal, which the intermediary possibly may not wholly understand. When Paderewski is at the pianoforte, we hear Paderewski, not someone else of a less sensitive temperament whom he is directing with a baton. A poet is at the instrument, and we hear the poet. A poet may be at the conductor's desk, but in the orchestra that is required for the interpretation of his musical conceptions, poets usually are conspicuous by their absence. Even great singers suffer because their accompaniments are apt not to be as sensitive of temperament as they are. And it is a fact that the grace and beauty of Schubert's Hark, Hark the Lark never have been so fully revealed to me by a singer as by Paderewski's playing of Liszt's arrangement of the song, because the pianist is able to shade the accompaniment to the most delicate nuances of the melody. How delightful, too, it is to go through the pianoforte score of a Wagner music drama, and as you play the wonderful music, all placed within the grasp of your 10 fingers, watch the scenic pictures and the action pass in imagination before your eyes in your own music room, without the defects inseparable from every public performance, because the success of a performance depends upon the cooperation of so many who do not cooperate. Yes, the pianoforte is the king of instruments because it is the most independent of instruments, and because it makes him who plays upon it independent. Music's debt to the pianoforte. It would be difficult to overestimate the debt that music owes to the pianoforte, including for the present under this one name the various keyboard instruments from which it was developed. The sonata form had its first tentative beginnings upon it, and was wrought out to perfection through it by a process of gradual evolution, extending from Domenico Scarlatti through Bach's son Philipp Emanuel Bach to Beethoven. As a symphony simply is a sonata for orchestra, it follows that through the sonata, and thus through the pianoforte, the form in which the classical composers cast their greatest works was established. Richard Strauss, in his revision of Berlioz's book on orchestration, even goes so far as to assert that Beethoven, and after him Schumann and Brahms, treated the orchestra pianistically. But the discussion of this point is better deferred until we take up the orchestra and orchestral music. Here, however, it may be observed that in addition to its constant use as an instrument for the concert hall and the home, and for the delight of great audiences and the joy of the amateur player and his familiar circle, many of the great composers, even when writing orchestral works, have used the pianoforte for their first sketches, testing their harmonies on it, and often, no doubt, while groping over the keys in search of the psychical note, hit upon accidental improvements and new harmonies. Even Wagner, who understood the orchestra as none other ever has, employed the pianoforte in sketching out his ideas. I went to my Erard and wrote out the passage as rapidly as if I had it by heart. He writes from Venice to Mathilde Wesendonck, in relating to her the genesis of the great love duet in Tristan und Isolde. And I could quote other passages from my Wagner and his Isolde, which is based on the romantic passages in the lives of the composer and the woman who inspired his great music drama, to show the frequency with which he made similar use of the universal musical instrument. The pianoforte has in many other ways been a boon to some of the most famous composers. Many of them were pianists, and by public performances of their own works, materially accelerated the appreciation of their music. Mozart was a youthful prodigy, and later a virtuoso of the highest rank. Beethoven, before he was overtaken by deafness, introduced his own pianoforte compositions to the public, and was the musical lion of the Viennese drawing rooms. Mendelssohn was a pianist of the same smooth, affable, gentlemanly type as his music. Chopin was not a miscellaneous concert player. His nature was too shrinking, but at the Salon Pleyel in Paris he gave recitals to the musical elite, who in turn conveyed his ideas to the greater public. Schumann began his musical career as a virtuoso, but strained the fourth finger of his right hand in using a mechanical apparatus which he had devised for facilitating the practice of finger exercises. His wife, Clara Wieck, however, who was the most famous woman pianist of her time, substituted her fingers for his. Liszt literally hewed out the way for his works on the keyboard. Brahms was a pianist of solid, scholarly attainments. In fact, dig where you will in musical soil, you strike the roots of the pianoforte. Its lowly origin. It must not be supposed, however, that the instrument as we know it attained to its present supremacy except through a long process of evolution. One of the immediate precursors of the modern pianoforte was the harpsichord, a name suggesting that the instrument was a harp with a keyboard attachment, and as such, in a general way, the pianoforte is. But the harp is a very fully developed affair compared with the mean little apparatus in which lay and was discovered many centuries ago the first germ of the king among instruments. This was the monochord, and it has required about 9 centuries for the evolution of an instrument consisting of a single string set in vibration by means of a keyboard attachment into the modern pianoforte. But do not be alarmed. I am not about to give a 900 years history of the pianoforte. Such detailed consideration would belong to a technical work on the manufacture of the instrument, and would be out of place here. Something of its history should, however, be known to everyone who wants to understand music, but I shall endeavour to be as brief and at the same time as clear as possible. The monochord originally was used much as we use a tuning fork, to determine true musical pitch. If you take a short piece of string, tie one end of it fast, draw it taut and pluck it, its vibrations will sound a note. If you grasp the string and draw it taut from nearer to the point where it is tied, you shorten what is called the node, increase the number of vibrations, and produce a higher note. The monochord, in its simplest form, consisted of a string drawn taut over an oblong box, and tuned to a given pitch by means of a peg. Under the string, and in contact with it, was a bridge or fret that could be moved by hand along a graduated scale marked on the bottom of the box. By moving the bridge, the node of the string could be shortened and the notes marked at corresponding points on the graduated scale produced. After a while, and in order to facilitate the study of the harmonious relationship between different notes, 3 strings were added, each with its bridge and graduated scale. It was more or less of a nuisance, however, to continually shift 4 bridges to as many different points under the 4 strings. As an improvement upon this awkward arrangement, some clever person conceived about the beginning of the 10th century the idea of borrowing the keyboard from the organ and attaching it to the monochord. To the rear end of each key was attached an upright piece called a tangent. When the finger pressed upon a key, the tangent struck one of the strings, set it in vibration, and at the same time, by contact, created a node which lasted as long as the key was kept down, and the tangent remained pressed against the string. To increase the utility of the instrument by adding more strings and more keys was the next obvious step, and gradually the monochord ceased to be a mere technical apparatus for the determining of pitch, and became an instrument on which professionals and amateurs could play with pleasure to themselves and others. A poet's advice to his musical daughter. There has been preserved to us from about the year 1529 a reply made by the poet Pietro Bembo to his daughter Elena, who had written to him from the convent where she was being educated, asking if she could have lessons upon the monochord, which seems to have been as popular in its day as its fully developed successor, the modern pianoforte, is now. touching thy request for permission to play upon the monochord, begins Bembo's quaint answer, I reply that because of thy tender years thou canst not know that playing is an art for vain and frivolous women, whereas I would that thou shouldst be the most chaste and modest maiden alive. Besides, if thou wert to play badly, it would cause thee little pleasure and no little shame. Yet in order to play well, thou must needs give up from 10 to 12 years to the exercise, without so much as thinking of aught else. How far this would benefit thee, thou canst see for thyself without my telling thee. But thy schoolmates, if they desire thee to learn to play for their pleasure, tell them thou dost not care to have them laugh at thy mortification. Therefore content thyself with the pursuit of the sciences and the practice of needlework. These words of the poet Bembo to his daughter Elena, are they so wholly lacking in application to our own day? And I wonder, did or did not Elena learn to play the monochord? If not, it was because she lived a few centuries too soon. She would have had her own way today. The clavichord. Monochord means one string, and the application of the term to the instrument after other strings had been added was a misnomer. The monochord on which Elena, to the evident distress of her distinguished parent, desired to play, really was a clavichord, which was derived directly from the primitive monochord. If you will raise the lid of your pianoforte, you will find that the strings become shorter from the bass up, the lowest note being sounded by the longest, the highest note by the shortest string. For the longer the string, the slower the vibrations, and the deeper the sounds produced, and vice versa. This principle is so obvious that it seems as if it must have been applied to the clavichord almost immediately, and a separate string provided for each key. But for many years the strings of the clavichord continued all of equal length, and 3 or 4 neighbouring keys struck the same string, so that the contact of the upright tangent with the string not only set the latter in vibration, but also served to form the node which produced the desired note. Not until after the clavichord had been in use several centuries were its strings made of varying length, and a separate string assigned to each key. These new clavichords were called buntfrei, fret-free or tangent-free, because the node of each string was determined by that string's length, and not by the contact of the tangent. The clavichord retained the box shape of its prototype, the monochord. Originally it was portable, and was set upon a table. Later, however, was made, so to speak, to stand upon its own legs. In appearance it resembled our square pianofortes. It gave forth a sweet, gentle, and decidedly pretty musical sound. It had a further admirable quality in its capacity for sustaining a note, since by keeping the tangent pressed against the string, the player was able to sustain the tone so long as the string continued to vibrate. Moreover, by holding down the key and at the same time making a gentle rocking motion with the finger, he was able to produce a tremolo effect, which German musicians called Bebung, trembling, and the French balancement. A defect of the clavichord was, however, its lack of power. This defect led to experiments which resulted in the construction of a keyboard instrument, the strings of which, in response to the action of the keys, were set in vibration by jacks tipped with crow quills or hard leather. The sound was much stronger than that of the clavichord, but the jacks twanged the strings with uniform power, permitting a sharp outline, but no shading of the tones. The harpsichord. If you chance to be listening to a Hungarian band at a restaurant, you may notice that one of the players has lying on a table before him an instrument with many strings, strung very much like those of the pianoforte. It is played with two little mallets in the player's hands, and produces the weird arpeggios and improvised runs characteristic of Hungarian gypsy music. It is a very old instrument called the cembalo. About the 15th century, it seems, someone devised a keyboard attachment with quills for this instrument, tipped the jacks with crow quills, and called the result a clavicembalo, a cembalo with keys. This was the origin of the harpsichord, the name by which the clavicembalo soon became more generally known. Harpsichords were shaped somewhat like our grand pianofortes, but were much smaller. A spinet was a small harpsichord, and the virginal a still smaller one. Sometimes, indeed, virginals were made no larger than work boxes, the instrument being taken out of the box and placed on a table before the player. For the purposes of this book, this very general survey of the precursors of the pianoforte seems sufficient. The clavichord and the instruments of the harpsichord, spinet, and virginal class flourished alongside of each other, but the best musicians gave the preference to the clavichord because of its sweet tone and the delicately tremulous effect that could be produced upon it by the balancement. Experiments in pianoforte making were in progress already in Bach's day, but he clung to the clavichord, as did his son Philipp Emanuel Bach. Mozart was the first of the great masters to realize the value of the pianoforte and to aid materially in making it popular by using it for his public performances. And yet even then the clavichord, that lonely, melancholy, unspeakably sweet instrument, was not abandoned without lingering regret by the older musicians, and it was still to be found in occasional use as late as the beginning of the last century. How thoroughly modern the pianoforte is will be appreciated when it is said that a celebrated firm of English makers, founded in 1730, did not begin to manufacture pianofortes until 1780, and continued the production of clavichords until 1793. Piano and forte. Neither on the clavichord nor on the harpsichord could the player vary the strength of the tone which he produced, by the degree of force with which he struck the keys. Swells and pedals worked by the knees and the feet were devised to overcome this difficulty. But touch, as we understand it today, was impossible with the instruments in which the degree of sound to be produced was not under the control of the player's fingers. The clavichord was piano, the harpsichord was forte. Not until the invention of the hammer action, the substitution of hammers for tangents and quill jacks, was an instrument possible in which whether the tone should be piano or forte depended upon the degree of strength with which the player struck the keys. This instrument was the first pianoforte. It was invented and so named in 1711 by Bartolomeo Cristofori of Florence, and although nearly 2 centuries have elapsed since then, the action used by many pianoforte manufacturers of today is in its essentials the same as that devised by this clever Italian. The invention frequently is ascribed to Gottfried Silbermann, a German, 1683 to 1753. But the real situation is that Cristofori was the inventor, while Silbermann was the first successful manufacturer of the new instruments from a business point of view. Time and improvements were required before they made their way, and how slow many professional musicians were in giving up the beloved clavichord for the pianoforte already has been pointed out. But the latter was bound to triumph in the end. I shall not attempt to give a technical description of the mechanism of the pianoforte, but I should like to answer a few questions which may have suggested themselves to players who may not have cared to take their instruments apart and examine them, or have not been present when their tuners have taken off the lid and exposed the strings and mechanism to view. The strings of the pianoforte are of steel wire, and their tension varies from 12 tons to nearly 20. Those of the deepest bass are covered with copper wire. 8 or 10 tones of the bass are produced by the vibration of these copper-wound strings. Above these, for about an octave and a half, the strings are in pairs, so that the hammer striking them, there are 2 unison strings to a tone simultaneously, and producing approximately twice as powerful a tone as if only one string had been set in vibration. The 5 remaining octaves have 3 strings to a tone. All depends on the player. When the fingers strike the keys, the hammers strike the strings, the force of the stroke depending upon the force exerted by the player, this being the distinguishing merit of the pianoforte as compared with its precursors. Under the strings are a row of dampers, and as soon as a finger releases a key, the corresponding damper springs into place against the vibrating strings, stops the vibrations, and the tone ceases. Thus, the tone can be dampened immediately by raising the finger, or prolonged by keeping the finger pressed down on the key. This is the device which enables the pianist to play staccato or legato. The damper pedal or loud pedal checks the action of all the dampers and prolongs the tones even after the fingers have released the keys. The soft pedal brings the hammers nearer the strings, shortens the stroke, and produces a softer tone. The simultaneous use of both pedals is a modern virtuoso effect, and a very charming one, for the damper pedal prolongs the gentle tones produced by the use of the soft pedal. I believe Paderewski was the first of the great pianists who have visited this country to employ this effect systematically, and that he was among the first composers to formally indicate the simultaneous employment of both pedals in passages in his compositions. There is a third pedal called the sustaining pedal, but I do not think it has proved as valuable an invention as was anticipated. Within recent years, there have been introduced mechanical pianofortes, which I may designate as pianolas, after the most popular instrument of their class. In my opinion, these instruments are destined to play an important part in the diffusion of musical knowledge, and it is senseless to underestimate this. There are thousands of people who have neither the time nor the dexterity to master the technique of the pianoforte, who nevertheless are people of genuine musical feeling, and who are enabled through the pianola to cultivate their taste for music. The device renders the music accurately. Whether expressively or not depends, as with the pianoforte itself, upon the taste of the person who manipulates it. Decorations that do not beautify. The pianoforte often is spoken of as an instrument of ugly appearance. This it emphatically is not. If the straight side of the grand is placed against the wall, the side toward the room presents a graceful sweeping curve, while the upright effectively breaks the straight line of the wall against which it stands. If the pianoforte is ugly, it is due to the so-called ornaments that are placed upon it. The knick-knacks, framed pictures, and other senseless things. To my mind, there is but one thing which it is permissible to place upon a pianoforte: a slender vase with a single flower, preferably a rose, the living symbol of the soul that waits to be awakened within the instrument. Sheet music or bound books of music on top of a pianoforte are an abomination. If scattered about, they look disorderly. If neatly arranged in portfolios, even worse, for they create the precise orderly appearance of paths and mounds in a cemetery. Often indeed the pianoforte is a graveyard of musical hopes. Because of that, however, it need not be made to look like one. Equally objectionable is the elaborately decorated or period pianoforte, designed for rooms decorated in the style of some historical art period. A pianoforte has no business in a period room. If the person is rich enough to afford period rooms, he also can afford a music room, and the simpler this is, within the bounds of good taste, and the less there is in it besides the instrument itself, the better. The more proficient the pianist, the less he cares for decoration, and the more satisfied he is with the pianoforte turned out in the ordinary course of business by the high-class manufacturer. No, decorated pianofortes are for those who are too rich to be musical.